Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're doing a three-part series and it's all about supporting a humanoid or humanish type character. In this particular case in parts. Um, it's a bit of a long one, so hang in there for the long stretch. I'm going to try and go over as much of this in detail as possible. Each plate that we set up is going to have a different amount of parts. This first one is really just focusing on detail. So we'll be starting with the head and the legs with those little bow designs there on the back. This is a brand new character. This is the Blacksmith from Digital Dark Pinups, and this is one of the brand new ones that literally just came out about a day ago. So we are currently working on hollowing our versions of it and supporting our versions of it right now. So what you're looking at is essentially me doing the supporting for these particular model kits. Now in this particular one, she has two head variations. She's got the orc head, and then she's got the human head. And we'll work on the orc head later. But for now, we're gonna focus on the legs and the human head. And the human head's a bit tricky because it's got that long chunk of hair at the bottom that you can't have her head facing down. You could turn it upside down if you wanted to and have the hair print last. But I actually like to use those big chunks of hair as a type of support, if you will, and have the rest of the object kind of pull off of that as well as the supports that are attached to it. Seems to work pretty well with a lot of these characters that have big, overstated hairdos, especially the ones with the pigtails. Now what I'm doing here is I'm doing the tree support there. As you saw, you join one support with the other, and to do that you just hold the Alt key when you drag that support. All you're going to do is just click the support normally where you would, and you're going to hold the Alt key and drag that towards another support or an area of the model. You can actually drag from one area of the model to another if you want to do supporting like that. Similar, just like I just did there, right there. So we're going to jump around from part to part as we do the islands first. And then once we address the island bits, we're going to start doing more heavily on the actual individual parts supporting. And like I said, I'm going to try and narrate as much of this as possible. I want to try and cover as many tool usage as possible. Right here we're using the mini supports, which again is holding Alt and Control at the same time. And that is a very, very handy tool as well. Mini supports are great for those areas where you want to add a little bit of springy stability, or for those areas where you just have some super fine delicate detail that you want to add a little tiny support to in order to support the material, but not really add that much damage to the material. And mini supports are the best way to go about doing that. In fact, it's the best way to support miniatures, if you will. But for bigger kits like this, we often don't rely on them as much because you're talking about much bulkier parts. You're not worried about breakage as much, unless you're talking about bits of like hair, things like that that stick out from the character a little bit. Those are issues that you might go, okay, well, that's a break point. And that might be something you want to focus on. But again, it really depends on the orientation, the type of character, what they're wearing, how their hair is done, that sort of thing. So all those factors kind of go into it. Help us how the sculpt was detailed as well. The texturing on the sculpt will also make a huge difference in how your supporting style is going to go. Again, if you're using tree supports like I'm doing here, where I'm extending this tree one support with 4 different connections to it. Again, you can go crazy with this. You can make the bar a little bit stronger, and then you have 4 points, so that way you have lighter points of contact on the actual model, but the bar itself is going to be a little bit thicker than normal, or you can brace it together with another bar to make it a little bit stronger, and that way you have that reinforced connection. I think it's important to remember just to kind of have a balance between both strength and support and the level of detail that you want to maintain. You can always sand away a couple of support bits here and there. That's a lot better than not being able to get the print off the build plate at all because it just didn't work. So there are a lot of things there to consider when you're doing your own hand supporting. And not to say that you can't just go and hit that auto support button and roll the dice and see if the program can do a decent enough job. In the beginning days of a lot of people's printing time with 3D printers, they will often rely very heavily on the auto support function. And usually what it'll do is it'll over support the item. And so if you're using a very heavy support style, it's going to over support the item, and it's going to be hellish for you to get those supports off of the item when you actually print it. In the other cases, it's going to under support because you're using an extremely light style of supporting, and it's going to not compensate for that, and it's going to create layers that are going to either suction off, or you're going to get issues where you get pancaking and inconsistent printing. So these are all things to consider. You can use auto supporting as a basis to start your support structure. You can even use it to see how the program would do the supporting on a particular part, and then go back and kind of modify what it's already done for you. As we go through each particular part here, I just want you to take notice that I am trying to pay as much attention to the yellow zones as possible. This is very important to note because the yellow zones are where most of the pressure is going to come from on the print. The yellow zones are areas that have a 40 to 45 degree angle or greater, and in the case that Lychee tries to identify those, like I said, as a yellowish kind of checker pattern, sort of reminds me of Sonic the Hedgehog, not gonna lie. And it covers the areas of the model that have this kind of pressure zone area, where what essentially you see most commonly is prints will fail if these areas are under supported. It is very important to make sure that these zones are the highest level of supporting on the particular print, because this is where most of your pullback is going to occur between the build plate and the FEP, and you want your build plate to win. So in order to do that, you need to make sure that you maintain a healthy level of support structure in those yellow zones, which is why I am crowding the heck out of the bottom of this leg. I'm also going to add bracings in there, as you saw I just did, and that's going to make that a really strong connection to the build plate and the raft. And even though it's a little tiny raft, that's literally just the bottom, it's going to make a decent enough connection there. I think that it's going to work really well. And we'll move along to the back of the leg, connecting some points there in the different areas that have the yellow zones, or as I call them, the hot zones. And just move up the leg, continuing to add supporting where it needs to be added the most. And like I said, you can use that Alt key to actually add supporting onto from one point of the model to another, which is an interesting way to add supporting. A lot of folks don't like adding supports on supports, or supports on the model, like point of contact being the model versus the model. As long as you're using a good support style, meaning your tips and such are not so super fat, and your penetration is 0, which mine is pretty much 0, you're not going to really damage anything too much to beyond repair. You're going to have to pull those supports off or clip them if you want. I mean, you can, the way I do my supports, they literally just bend right off and you can just pop them off. To the point where sometimes I actually wonder, you know, like, it's interesting that I'm able to remove them so easily, but they do survive the printing process quite well. So, you know, they speak for themselves. The details of my prints and the models that we sell are amazing. I get a lot of good comments and feedback on the stuff that we sell and the stuff that we make. So again, the style that I use here that you're seeing is the style that I use for pretty much everything we print and everything that I support by hand, which is a good 80% of the stuff that we have. All right, and we'll wrap up the rest of the right leg, just finishing up the upper part there, making sure we get the areas on the front part of the foot, which will complete the islands for this particular part. And again, you know, keeping in mind that we're trying to maintain detail. The legs have these little straps on the feet. The shoes have a decent amount of detail there. As we discussed, there's some bows on the back of the legs. And of course, there's the hair and the facial detail. And all of that is extremely important. In the matter of the legs and stuff, as I said numerous amounts of times, whenever you have a part that is longer or larger or creates a big surface area, the hollowing routine is usually pretty good. But make sure that when you do, you have adequate drain holes. There are some times where you will do this, and we'll do the holes, and we'll kind of not think of orientation. Remember, Lychee has a tool now where you can check that under the hollowing tab. On the prepare tab, you'll find the suction cup search, and that will help you a lot. Recently used it to find some major flaws in a model that I was working on that had already been pre-hollowed, and was able to figure out some of the issues there using that suction cup search. So that is a great tool for hollowed parts. Now in this particular sense, I'm going to try and do both legs as similarly as possible. Similarly, not sure that's a word. As close as possible to this, to each leg. And we're going to try and make sure that they're balanced as well as possible on the bottom, creating enough support structure to build them up. So we don't have to riddle them with supports as they kind of climb up out of the build. And that will help them, to maintain some of that detail along the leg as well, that we don't want to have to stick a bunch of extra supports on, because we already have to put the supports in numerous amounts of places on the leg anyway, to make sure that we don't lose any detail and we don't have any pancaking and things like that. Now, at the bottom of the leg here, I'm using the inline support a little bit to try to add some supports quickly. But as you see there, when you're working with weird objects that aren't exactly square or super flat all over, sometimes they just kind of want to put themselves wherever they feel like, which is really strange, but I get it. They weren't really meant for that. I'm kind of using them in a way that they really weren't intended. But it does go to show you that there are more uses for it than I think it's been given credit for. I use it on round objects quite a lot. What I'll do is I'll just draw straight lines of supports that go across the round surface, obviously being careful not to go over the edge or through any hollowing points. Now, depending on how tall the particular object is, in this case, these are about 120 millimeters tall, and that's at a bit of an angle. So again, they're pretty long legs, and it's because it's the majority of her leg. It's actually about half of her thigh, the knee, the full calf, and the foot. So it is a decent amount of the actual character's leg. And I think in that sense, they're tall. So you want to make sure that you have enough support for this object going up, because it's going to be there printing for quite a while, meaning it has more of a propensity to fail anywhere in that track, but it's got a higher value of failing in between those gaps in support, where it's relying on what's on the bottom or it's relying on what's in the middle, and it doesn't have a whole lot in between, which is why I'm putting all the extra layer of support in the middle where the boot starts, and up, of course, around where the foot is, to give all of that the added, extra support that it's going to need in order to print properly. And again, it may seem excessive sometimes when I do a lot of this excess supporting, especially on areas of the body like this where we're looking to save detail. But trust me, with the support tips that we use, you're not losing detail here. They're going to detach quite easily, and you'll be able to remove them. And if any little pieces are left, they're going to be removable very easily, or easily just sanded right off. Our finisher and most of our customers, I think 99.9% of our people that we've worked with, have told us that the models are extremely easy to finish. And that is, again, all thanks to the way that we support the models. Now, again, I'll cover over some of the hotkeys that we were talking about before, because a lot of people ask, they want to know the commands that we use. So when you're applying a support, obviously that's just a simple click. You're just going to click on the style support you want. And don't forget, you can always override the original presets if you want to use your own custom settings like we do. We don't rely on the particular settings that Lychee gives you. We use our own settings. and we override those settings so that we can quickly kind of swap back and forth between the different tabs of light, medium, and heavy. In fact, we're even planning on doing a video in the future where we discuss the different reasons why we use different types of support, light, medium, and or heavy. And we don't use a lot of heavy supports, so you can imagine if I do, it's probably a very large object. In fact, most recently I had to use a heavy support that was so big, I honestly was concerned it was going to create so much damage on the model, but thank goodness it was only on the bottom, so really wasn't that much of a problem. So again, when you're doing the tree supports, that's going to be holding Alt and then dragging the support from the model to an existing support or to another part of the model itself. Now, that's not a tree support if you just tree it from one part of the model to itself. That's more of just kind of like an on-board support, really, that's just part of the model. And while those do work in some cases, and you can actually get some adequate support there, you do have a chance of both ends of that failing if you have any issues with that particular part of the print. So keep that in mind. It's not always the best thing in the world to start your supporting or do your supporting based on print, support to print or support to model tips. It's okay sometimes to do that with your mini supports. In fact, that's really good with mini supports for the most part because they don't leave any damage at all. But when you're talking about bigger supports, anything larger than a a 0.22 millimeter tip, I think is going to cause too much damage, and you don't really want to do that all over the place. Not going to be a really good thing unless you absolutely have to. And there are some occasions where I've just seen overhangs and stuff that just fall in such the worst place that you absolutely have to. And kind of that falls under the fault of the artist. Whoever sculpted the piece didn't really consider the actual fundamentals of 3D printing when they were designing it, and those kind of things get overlooked all the time, constantly. Trust me, we see a lot. We work with a lot of different models from a lot of different artists, and a lot of different times they're like, oh, this wasn't thought out, or man, nobody thought about how hard this was going to be to support, or what orientation would work best for that. So yeah, we have fun all the time doing this kind of stuff. So when you get into hand supporting and you learn how to do this really well, part of the trick is really being able to understand, okay, look at the model, orient it the way you think it should be oriented. Once you get that orientation to a point where the print surface area to print itself is going to be a nice balance, then you start doing your island checks, then you start adding your supporting, and then you kind of refine from there. Now, you'll find that the different tools you have, like the support painter that I'm using right now, they can aid you in your workflow. They can help make your workflow faster. There are also other things like I've discussed before, like the inline painter. There's the availability of course, using the auto support system to start you out and then kind of working from there. That's a really fast way to get your workflow going. A lot of people ask me, well, what's the best way to support the interior of a model when you hollow it? Well, in some cases, I would say go ahead and just do auto support and then delete all the external supports one at a time. This sounds like a bit of a workaround, and it's a bit of a time kill because you do have to kind of like go one by one. But the Lychee will do a really good job at internally supporting your model, and it won't overkill it the way it likes to do on the outside of the model. So do try that once in a while and see how that works out for you, because it's a decent workflow alternative to going through the model slice by slice or using the exterior interior tab if you're working with Lychee's native hollowing tools, which I don't use very often, but that's also a fairly awkward way to do it, and honestly I don't like doing it that way either. Now, as we work our way up the head, as you've been seeing here, I'm jabbering over this process, but again, we're really just focusing on the areas that have the yellow zones first. The yellow checkered zones are going to be your primary areas, and we're trying to paint on supports using the presets that we have set up in the support painter, and then if I find necessary, I usually down tune them. If I see too many clusters in, I'll lower them up to a light. If I see too many mediums pop into a particular area where I'm trying to conserve detail. And you can see that created a little bit of a shelf there with the supporting, and it's actually quite a line. I'm not really concerned about that fusing or doing anything weird. It's going to be quite strong, and to be honest, with a print like this with a hair chunk at the bottom, you almost need that little bit of additional strength going on to make sure that it doesn't pull itself off. She is going to be a bit of a heavy piece when this head prints because it is not hollow, and so I think, maybe having a couple extra supports along that hair piece and stuff might be a good idea, especially on the side of the head like that. So I'm not going to be too concerned about the bottom of those tips, because I think in the most part this will just snap right off the supports anyway once I go in there and squeeze them off. Now once we finish this bit, we're going to go ahead and do the layer by layer search. And I will actually do the layer slider and show you guys exactly how I go over a piece layer by layer. And I know we've probably gone over this before, but I'm going to go over this one in a lot more detail than we normally do in some of our other videos. Again, this is a really long form video. I think the total is about 35 plus minutes. So thank you guys so much for bearing with us. We're almost through. And remember, this is only part 1 of 3. So if you really want to get through the rest of this, we do have 2 more videos coming for this same exact series, and they will be coming out, well, at the same time. So you'll be able to watch them all, because who doesn't like binge watching stuff? Okay, now as you work your way up with the layer slider, what you're really looking for is you're looking for areas that you may have neglected that have, I'd say, a decent amount of print area that's starting, but maybe you only have 1 support there. In some cases that might be okay, depending on what it is, how heavy that part is going to wind up being, or how long it's going to be isolated from the rest of the print. If it's an island that's kind of floating off on its own, that literally has no other support other than this one little stick, then make sure that it has adequate support to make it before it joins the rest of the model. One of the biggest things that I learned early on was making sure that not just the model itself was printed right, but that the other attributes around it were printing good too, so that way it had got all of its details and nothing pancaked off. The biggest failure issue that a lot of printers face early on is pancaking. And that, in case you don't know, is essentially when one particular part of the model flattens or doesn't really get printed properly because the item just, well, it wasn't supported well enough and it got squished. Or, yeah, I mean, it's not a good thing. In some cases, folks will call these what we know as partial failures, and I just call them failures because in my business, you can't sell a partial failure and I can't do much with it. It goes in a box called defects, and maybe one day I'll use it as a painting dummy to test out some new techniques. But to be honest, it's a waste of material and it's a really, really hard thing to throw away, but there we go. I mean, that's pretty much all it is. But the best way to avoid those problems, obviously, is to make sure that your printing is as adequately supported and handled as well as possible. The reason we hand support things is because we had so many issues with pre-supported files through our early days in printing, and we just, even now with some of the guys that we work with, you know, it's not that I don't trust them. I don't think their work is bad. We just prefer the way we do it ourselves. There are some companies we will not re-support files, obviously, because we just know they work and their styles are so similar to our own that there's no reason to. But if we differ too much or we find that the style just isn't cohesive to the way we like to work, we'll often just take the files and re-support them by hand. And usually this works out pretty well because we wind up to get, you know, to do it the way we want it to, and the prints come out in such a way that it's predictable for us. Whereas when you're working with a pre-supported file, you don't know where those supports were put on. You don't really have a mindset of, okay, I know where to attack from when I go to remove them, and that sort of thing. And so I think it's important to understand that that's all part of the process. Being able to put them on and remove them is important. And I think working with the pre-supported files, it's kind of like working with a mystery because you don't really know how that's going to be to remove or what the best way to do it because you didn't lay them out. You'll notice what I'm looking for as we do we do the slider up and down is I'm looking for areas of the model that are starting the sections of the print. In most cases, what we look for is we look for isolated zones. We look for islanded areas. We look for areas that are starting out on their own, things that have to have enough support in order to join themselves back into the rest of the model. It's important to note that these areas can be easy to miss because in some cases they start off as small as like a pixel or two and will build up into the larger areas that they wind up turning into. The problem is you're not going to know this too much Unless you're being as careful as possible, you'll miss zones like this one here, where there's a large yellow path right there underneath that piece of hair that definitely would have caused a pancake, for sure, with lack of supporting underneath it. That whole archway would have had an issue, and it may have printed okay, but to be honest, I'd rather not take the chance, and I'd rather just give it the extra support that it needs in order to make sure that it prints properly. Now the head is a larger object. It's a little tall because of the hair, the way it hangs down. And I'm actually using the hair as kind of like a supporting system. So the supports on the bottom are supporting the hair quite a lot, but the rest of the head itself is going to lean on the hair when it comes to the actual big chunk of the head once the rest of it prints. Now, the thing is the hair and the head are actually kind of side by side right now, and they haven't joined up, but eventually they will. And so the last couple layers of the head, which is the last few hundred layers of the head, will be printed while the ponytail and the rest of the head are joined. This will give that last part of the print enough extra strength to make sure that it doesn't decide to pop off or break free. With a large object like the head that's not hollowed, unlike the legs, you have to make sure that you give it enough support to control it down and keep it on the build plate. Otherwise, you're going to wind up fishing it out of your vat, and you're going to wind up filtering your resin, and yeah, all kinds of fun stuff. It's never the way I want to spend my mornings, trust me. Now here what we're trying to do is we're trying to join up this support back to where it belongs because it is disconnected. I want to say disconnected, it's kind of estranged from its island. It looks like there's an island here that it wants to connect to. It's probably thinking it's connected to it, but because the island is actually kind of small, it has missed it. So Lychee here has miscalculated, and essentially the support has kind of drifted. And again, that's not Lychee's fault. That's mostly because of the fact that the island itself is so small. In this particular case, it's also kind of hard to see because everything's so clustered in on this object, and we do have a decent amount of supports sitting in one area because of, again, the fact that there is a decent amount of material being printed in this column. I'm putting enough supports here, light supports, all around it to support it as it prints to make sure that we don't have any drop-offs or loss or pancaking or anything like that. But we definitely want to make sure that we reinforce this spot because, as you can see, this doesn't really have a lot of help for a couple layers. So you have this chunk that's building, but it doesn't really have a lot of added supports until you get a little bit further on. So what we'll do is we'll drag on some mini supports here, and we'll connect some of this panel, this bit here, this little bit that's going to connect to the bottom of her neck. We'll have some mini supports, and you'll see we'll go from like one connection point to from 1, 2, 3, 4, and then from there it's going to start growing off into the other connection points with the supports, and it'll already have an adequate amount of support there, I think, as it builds up. But initially there, having that one support there was not a good idea. I think that would definitely have caused some problems. Much like these little front little bits of hair, which will use a tree support there to handle that connection. And I'm pretty sure we have one on the other side as well. So we'll take a look at that as that grows as well with the layer slider. Now again, we're looking for the point where the ponytail connects to the rest of the head as well, so we can kind of see the way that that's going to join up and build up the rest of the head. The little tails in the front, or the I guess the front of the hair there, just need to make sure that those are adequately supported because they are floating off the head for a little bit of time as well. See, this is what we talked about. A piece here like this that started from an island creates a pretty decent sized chunk before it even reconnects back to the model. The same thing is going to go for anything like hair. These little ears, for example, are another little bit of an issue because you have this little chunk that's building off to the side and it's not fully connected to a support there. So we're going to try and drag that support a little bit further over and probably even add another support tip in there to try to reinforce that connection. So now it's going to have a little bit more support there until it attaches to the head rather. And I think that again kind of circles back to the same point of just make sure when you do have an islanded area that it is adequately supported for the printing process, that it is an island. An island is not just an island for the first moment that it's printing. It is still an island until it reconnects to the main body of the print, and then it is no longer an island. But while it is an island, it is absolutely necessary to make sure that it is supported properly, because otherwise that's where you're going to find levels of pancaking or partial failures. And that's very important to note. And as you can see there, the ponytail finally connects right about the middle of the head. Right above, I think, right above the ear. So yeah, we're almost at about the eye level there. Actually, we are right about the eye level. And so the rest of this, the large chunk of the head that we still have left to print, which is a decent amount, is going to be supported by the hair now that is connected to the head. Now these little bits in the front have now connected to the front of the face. The nose has formed, and the majority of the face details are now there. But you still have a decent chunk of forehead and the top of the head that still needs to print. And in order to not cover the rest of the top of the head and the back of the head with more supporting, I'm just going to let that ponytail, which is very well supported down at the bottom, continue the rest of the print from the eyes on up, with very, 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 very little support left from that area on up. Even the archway itself isn't really necessarily need to be supported, because those two parts are going to join together pretty seamlessly. And as you can see, the legs join up here pretty well, and the feet just come right out. No issues there, no real big islanding issues there, and that's pretty much ready to go. So anyway, guys, that is all for this particular part. I'm going to let you enjoy that export slice and a little bit of tunes, and we'll see you all in the next part.